The sun over Dry Hollow was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth until the dust itself seemed to give up and surrender, rising in a fine, choking powder that coated every surface and clung to the soul. The year was 1886, and the town was little more than a scar on the vast, unforgiving hide of the West Texas landscape. It was a place of straight lines and hard edges, the single dusty main street, the stark, unpainted wooden buildings, the rigid lines of societal expectation. There were two kinds of law in Dry Hollow, the one written in a dusty book in Sheriff Miller's office, rarely consulted, and the one that came from the barrel of a gun or the weight of a coin purse. Horace Blackwood had both. In a small, tidy house at the edge of this desolation lived Clara May Thompson. At 18, she was a creature of soft curves in a world of sharp angles. An orphan since the fever took her parents when she was 12. She existed in the shadow of her aunt, Martha, a woman whose grief had long since calcified into a brittle and severe piety. Martha was a widow herself, and she saw the world as a series of debts and payments. Clara's existence was a debt, one she was reminded of daily through chores that began before sunrise and ended long after sunset. "A woman's place is secured through obedience," Martha would say, her voice as dry as the rattling seed pods on a dead yucca plant. "You have no name, no money, no land. All you have is your virtue and your willingness to please. Do not squander them." Clara learned this lesson well. She learned to lower her eyes, to keep her opinions behind her teeth, to move through a room as if she were a ghost, taking up as little space as possible. She was taught that to be noticed was to be a nuisance, and to be a nuisance was to risk being cast out into the unforgiving sun. Her life was a narrow corridor, and she walked it with careful, measured steps, her gaze fixed on the floorboards ahead. Then Horace Blackwood's wife, Eleanor, succumbed to a wasting sickness. The whole town mourned, for Eleanor had been a kind, if quiet, woman. Horace, a man of 55 with a face like a weathered rock and hands thick enough to snap a man's wrist, mourned for precisely 2 years. Then, his gaze fell upon Clara. He didn't court her with flowers or soft words. Such things were frivolous, a waste of time and resources. He conducted the matter as he did all his business, directly and with the expectation of compliance. He came to Martha's house one Tuesday afternoon, his large frame filling the doorway, blocking out the sun. He spoke to Martha, not to Clara, who was darning socks in the corner, her needle moving with practiced, silent efficiency. "Martha," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I mean to take a new wife. Clara is of age. She is healthy and of good bearing. I will have her." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, like declaring the sun would set. Martha's thin lips, usually pressed into a line of perpetual disapproval, almost curved into a smile. This was more than she could have ever hoped for. To have Clara married to the wealthiest man in the county was a monumental achievement, a final settlement of the girl's debt. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice uncharacteristically warm. "You honor our humble home. Of course, she will be a dutiful wife." The town agreed. At the general store, the women whispered that it was a fine match. "He'll give her security," they said, nodding sagely. "A girl with nothing needs security." The men at the saloon slapped Horace on the back. "A fine young filly to warm your bed." "Horace." They laughed. Good for keeping the line going. No one asked Clara what she thought. Her thoughts were not a commodity of any value. Clara felt a cold dread coil in her stomach. She had seen Horace Blackwood at church, had seen the way his eyes lingered on things, not with affection, but with an air of ownership. He looked at his cattle the same way he looked at his land, the same way he was now looking at her. She did not love him. She feared him. The thought of his thick, calloused hands on her, of sharing his bed, made her skin crawl. But her aunt's words echoed in her mind. A woman's place is secured through obedience. To refuse would be an act of rebellion so profound she couldn't even imagine its consequences. It would mean shaming her aunt, turning the entire town against her, and being cast out with nothing but the clothes on her back. And so, when Martha turned to her with eyes like chips of flint and said, "You will accept Mr. Blackwood's proposal?" Clara, she did. Her yes was a whisper, a thread of sound so faint it was nearly lost in the oppressive silence of the room. The wedding was set for a month's time. The days that followed were a blur of preparations. Clara moved like a clockwork doll, being measured for a dress of stiff, unforgiving lace, listening to the townswomen give her crude advice, accepting their false congratulations with a numb smile. Her world had shrunk to the size of a coffin. A week before the wedding, the Reverend Miller's wife sent word that she was feeling poorly and asked if Clara might deliver a small parcel of medicinal herbs to their home on the other side of the creek, eager for any excuse to escape the suffocating atmosphere of her aunt's house. Clara saddled their old, sway-backed mare, Bess. The air was hot and still, the sky a vast, empty blue. For a few moments, as she rode, she felt a flicker of freedom. It was a rattlesnake, coiled in the shade of a mesquite bush, that shattered the peace. Bess shied violently, her eyes wide with terror. Clara, lost in her thoughts, was caught off guard. She was thrown from the saddle, landing hard on the rocky ground with a cry of pain. Her head struck a stone, and the world exploded in a flash of white before darkness rushed in. When she came to, a face was hovering over her. It was not a face she knew. It was a man's face, lean and weathered by the sun, with a scruff of dark beard and eyes the color of a stormy sky. He was not handsome in the way the town dandies were, but there was a stillness in his gaze, a quiet intensity that held her. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and calm. "Just lie still. Reckon you hit your head pretty good." He helped her sit up, his touch surprisingly gentle. Pain shot through her ankle. He examined it with practiced hands. "It's a bad sprain, but not broken," he concluded. He took a canteen from his hip and offered it to her. The water was cool and tasted of metal and life. "I'm Eli," he said simply, as if that were all the explanation needed. He was a drifter, a cowboy. That much was clear from his worn leather chaps and the dusty brim of his hat. He had a bedroll and a rifle tied to his saddle, but no other worldly possessions to speak of. He helped her onto his own horse, a powerful roan, and led her and old Bess back towards Dry Hollow. They didn't speak much on the way. The silence between them was not awkward. It was a comfortable, shared space. Clara, who had spent her life learning to be invisible, felt strangely seen. He didn't ask her a litany of questions or fill the air with meaningless chatter. He just watched the trail, his presence a solid, reassuring weight beside her. When he looked at her, his stormy eyes seemed to see past the obedient niece and the prospective bride, to the frightened girl trapped inside. When they reached her aunt's house, Eli helped her down and explained what had happened. Martha's gratitude was thin, stretched over a thick layer of suspicion. A strange man, a drifter, bringing her niece home? It was unseemly. "He'll need a place to stay the night," Clara said, her voice stronger than she expected. "His horse is spent, and he saved me." Martha couldn't refuse without appearing uncharitable. She offered Eli the barn, and a plate of cold beans and bread, her disapproval a palpable force in the air. Later that evening, as Clara sat on the porch, her swollen ankle propped up on a stool, Eli emerged from the barn. He leaned against the porch railing, rolling a cigarette with nimble fingers. "This is a hard place," he said, not as a judgment, but as a simple observation. He lit the cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating the lines on his face. "It's all I've ever known," Clara replied softly. "You're set to be married," he stated. It wasn't a question. News traveled fast in a town like Dry Hollow. Clara just nodded, her eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. To Horace Blackwood, Eli continued, his voice flat. He took a slow drag from his cigarette. He's a man who likes to own things. In that moment, a profound connection passed between them, an unspoken understanding that defied logic and time. He was a stranger, a man with dust on his boots and no future to speak of. Yet he saw her more clearly than anyone in her entire life. He saw the cage, and he saw the bird with the broken wing inside it. Two lonely souls, both scarred by the world in their own ways, recognizing the wounds in each other without a single word of confession. The next morning, he was ready to leave before the sun had fully risen. He saddled his roan, his movements fluid and efficient. Clara limped out to the barn, a small parcel of bread and dried meat in her hand. "For the trail," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He took it, his fingers brushing against hers. The brief touch sent a jolt through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. He saw the resignation there, the fear she tried so hard to hide. He mounted his horse, looked down at her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Then, he leaned down slightly, his voice low and meant only for her. "If you ain't smilin' on your wedding day," he said, his gaze unwavering, "I'll be back." And with that, he tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode out, disappearing into the vast, dusty emptiness from which he had come, leaving behind a promise that was both a comfort and a terrifying, impossible hope. Eli's promise was a ghost that haunted the edges of Clara's days. She tried to banish it, to bury it under the mountain of chores and preparations for a life she did not want. In the week that followed his departure, she became a model of automaton-like efficiency. She stitched the final seams on her wedding dress, the needle pricking her fingers until they were numb, a small, distant pain that was nothing compared to the hollowness in her chest. She polished her aunt's silver, scrubbing away the tarnish until her own reflection stared back, a pale, blank-faced stranger. The women of Dry Hollow buzzed around her like flies on a summer carcass. They brought small gifts, a lace handkerchief, a jar of spiced peaches, and offered congratulations that felt as sharp as stones. Their eyes, however, held a different story. They were the eyes of appraisers, of judges, of fellow prisoners offering condolences to the newest inmate. They inspected the quality of the dress fabric, the dowry linens Martha had painstakingly assembled, the very curve of Clara's waist. They saw her not as a bride, but as a transaction, a successful bartering of youth and fertility for security and status. "You're a very lucky girl, Clara," said Mrs. Gable, the mercantile owner's wife, her smile a brittle thing. "Horace Blackwood will provide for you. A woman can ask for nothing more. Remember your duty, a quiet house and a warm bed. That's the key to a happy husband." The unspoken words hung in the air, and your own survival. The land itself seemed to conspire in this grim lesson of survival. It was a place that had long forgotten gentleness. The sun baked the ground into a mosaic of deep, thirsty cracks. The wind was a relentless thief, stealing moisture from the soil and hope from the heart, leaving behind a fine grit that settled in the lines of one's face and the folds of one's clothes. The people were a reflection of the land that shaped them. The men were hard, their faces leathered, their conversations clipped and practical. The women were harder still, their spirits worn down by childbirth, drought, and the quiet endurance of a life with few choices. They were taught that love was a luxury, a frivolous notion from the storybooks that came on the Eastern stagecoach. Here, there was only duty, propriety, and the brutal arithmetic of existence. Clara's marriage to Horace was, in the town's collective mind, a sound calculation. An orphan with nothing plus a landowner with everything equaled a neat and tidy solution. Clara moved through this world, her promise from Eli a secret, painful ember she tried to extinguish. "If you ain't smilin' on your wedding day." The words were foolish, impossible. He was gone. He was a drifter, a phantom who had appeared and vanished, leaving only the echo of a ridiculous vow. She would do her duty. She would walk to the altar, say the words, and become Mrs. Horace Blackwood. She would smile, even if it cracked her face. Miles away, Eli rode under the same merciless sun. He had put Dry Hollow behind him, telling himself it was for the best. He was not a man who put down roots. He was a man who moved on. The world was full of sad-eyed girls and brutish men. It was not his place to intervene. He had his own ghosts, his own past he was riding away from. But the image of Clara's face, of the quiet desperation in her eyes, was a burr under his saddle blanket, a constant, irritating presence. He told himself he had imagined it. He had ridden for 2 days, pushing his roan hard, when he came across a boy, no older than 10, watching over a half-dozen scrawny longhorns. The boy was singing a tuneless song to himself, poking at a horned lizard with a stick. Eli reined in his horse, needing to confirm his direction. "Afternoon, son," Eli said, tipping his hat. "Am I still on the trail to Fort Griffin?" The boy looked up, squinting against the sun. "Yes, sir. About another day's ride? You coming from Dry Hollow?" "Pass through," Eli said non-committally. The boy's face lit up with the simple excitement of having news to share. "You missed the big doin's. Mr. Blackwood's getting hitched tomorrow. To that orphan girl, Clara Thompson. The whole town's talking about it." He paused, then added with the unfiltered honesty of a child. "My ma says she's being forced into it. Says the girl looks like she's heading to her own funeral." The boy's words struck Eli with the force of a physical blow. Heading to her own funeral. He remembered the look in her eyes as he rode away. He remembered the faint tremor in her hand as she gave him the parcel of food. He remembered his own foolish, impulsive words. "If you ain't smiling," he had seen that look before, in another woman's eyes, a lifetime ago. A woman he had failed to save. Without a word of thanks or goodbye to the bewildered boy, Eli pulled hard on the reins. The roan grunted in protest, but obeyed. Turning in a cloud of dust, he dug his heels into its flanks, his jaws set like granite. He was no longer riding away from something. He was riding back towards it. The morning of the wedding dawned hot and airless. Clara stood before the small, cracked mirror in her room, while her aunt pulled the laces of the corset so tight she could barely breathe. The dress was heavy, a cage of bone and lace. Her face was a pale, emotionless mask. She could feel Martha's triumphant gaze on her back. "Stand up straight," Martha commanded. "You are to be Mrs. Horace Blackwood. You will carry his name with dignity. There will be no tears. There will be no long face. You will smile." Clara did not answer. She could not. Her throat was a knot of unshed tears and unspoken screams. The walk to the small, sun-bleached church was the longest of her life. The dust of the street puffed up around the hem of her white dress, soiling it. The townspeople were lined up, watching. She felt their eyes on her like insects crawling on her skin. Inside, the church was packed. It smelled of dry wood, beeswax, and the cloying scent of the wild desert blooms that decorated the altar. At the end of the aisle, Horace stood waiting. He was dressed in a black suit that seemed too tight for his bulky frame. He looked impatient, his eyes fixed on her with that same look of ownership. He was not looking at a bride. He was waiting for a delivery. As the wheezing organ began to play, Clara took the arm of the town's portly mayor, who was to give her away. Each step was a lifetime. The faces in the pews swam before her eyes. "Smile." Her aunt's voice hissed in her mind. "Smile." But her lips were frozen. Her face felt like stone. She was not smiling. She reached the altar. The mayor placed her hand into Horace's. His grip was firm, possessive, his palm sweating slightly. She stared straight ahead at the stained glass window behind the Reverend Miller, a crude depiction of a shepherd and his flock. the colors faded by decades of relentless sun. The Reverend's voice began, a familiar, monotonous drone. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and this company to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." It was then that a shadow fell across the open doorway at the back of the church. A few heads turned. Annoyed at the interruption, a man stood there, silhouetted against the blinding white light of the street. He was covered in dust, his face grim with exhaustion. He took off his hat, his eyes scanning the room until they found her. It was Eli. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. He ignored them. He started walking down the aisle, his spurs making a soft, rhythmic jingle against the floorboards, a sound as out of place as a wolf's howl in a chicken coop. He did not rush. He walked with a calm, deliberate purpose that was more terrifying to the onlookers than any shouted threat. Horace turned, his face darkening with fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he growled, his hand instinctively going to the pistol holstered under his suit coat. Eli didn't look at him. His stormy gray eyes were locked on Clara, and in them, she saw the question he had come all this way to ask. He stopped when he reached the front pew, just a few feet from her. The Reverend Miller, flustered, stammered, and tried to regain control. "If any man can show just cause, why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace." The silence in the church was absolute, thick and heavy. It was the moment of truth. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. In that deafening quiet, Eli took 2 more steps, closing the distance between them. He leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear, his voice a low, urgent whisper that cut through the paralysis that held her. "Don't marry him." The words were a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. For a single, crystalline moment, there was no one else in the world. Then, chaos erupted. A woman screamed. Men jumped to their feet, their chairs scraping loudly against the wooden floor. Horace's face contorted into a mask of pure rage. "You bastard!" he roared, and with a single violent motion, he drew his Colt revolver, the metallic click of the hammer being cocked echoing through the church like a death knell. He pointed it squarely at Eli's chest. Clara stood frozen, a statue in white, trapped in the terrifying space between the 2 men. One held her future in his sweaty, possessive hand. The other held a gun, and in the middle, she stood trembling, her life, her soul, hanging suspended in a single, shattering heartbeat. The crack of Horace Blackwood's pistol was a deafening punctuation mark to a ceremony that had already dissolved into chaos. The bullet tore a chunk of wood from the church rafters, raining splinters down on the stunned congregation. For a moment, a stunned silence followed the echo, thicker and more profound than the one Eli's whisper had broken. Then, the dam of decorum burst. Women shrieked, men shouted, and the room became a churning sea of panic and outrage. Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine was as malleable as the wad of chewing tobacco in his cheek, was the first to act. He was Horace Blackwood's man, and his duty was clear. He and his deputy pushed through the crowd, their own guns drawn. "All right, that's enough," Miller bellowed, his authority sounding thin against the backdrop of pandemonium. "You're under arrest, drifter!" Eli didn't resist. He had accomplished what he came to do. As the deputy roughly grabbed his arms and bound them with a rope, Eli's gaze found Clara's. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a dawning, fragile hope that was almost more painful to see. She was a statue, just as he had feared, but a statue whose marble was beginning to crack. That fragile hope was extinguished as her aunt, Martha, seized her by the upper arm, her fingers digging in like talons. "You have shamed us all," Martha hissed, her voice a venomous whisper as she dragged Clara out a side door. Away from the prying eyes of the town, the short walk home was a blur of dust and humiliation, once inside their small, stifling house. Martha shoved Clara into her bedroom. The mask of public piety fell away, revealing a face twisted with a cold, unforgiving fury. For a lifetime of repressed anger, Clara became the focal point. Martha's hand flew, and the sharp, stinging slap that cracked across Clara's cheek was as loud as the gunshot in the church. "Foolish, ungrateful girl," Martha seethed, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "Do you have any idea what you have done? You have thrown away security. You have thrown away a name. For what? A filthy, rootless vagrant?" Clara, her cheek burning, tasted blood in her mouth. She said nothing, her silence fueling her aunt's rage. "The wedding will proceed tomorrow, at noon," Martha declared, her voice flat and final. "Horace has agreed. He is a forgiving man, more forgiving than you deserve. You will go to that church, you will say the words, and you will belong to him. You owe me your life, girl. I took you in when you had nothing. No one gets to love freely here. Love is a price we cannot afford." She pulled the key from the inside of the door, slammed it shut, and the sound of the lock turning was the sound of a coffin being sealed. Clara was left in the sudden, suffocating silence of her room, a prisoner in the home that had never been a sanctuary. An hour later, a heavy, deliberate footstep sounded on the porch. Martha opened the door to Horace Blackwood. He did not ask to see Clara. He commanded it. Martha unlocked the bedroom door and Horace filled the frame, his bulk seeming to suck all the air from the small space. He dismissed Martha with a flick of his wrist. He did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. His tone was colder and more dangerous than any shout. "You made a spectacle of me today, girl," he said, his eyes like two chips of granite. "I do not abide being made a spectacle. You will have one more chance to do what is expected of you. One." He took a step closer, and Clara shrank back against the wall. "But know this, if you humiliate me again, there is not a corner of this territory where you will be able to beg for a crust of bread. There is no ditch deep enough for you to hide in. I will not have to raise a hand against you. I will simply erase you. You will find every door closed, every face turned away. You will learn what it truly means to be alone and without a place in this world. Do you understand me?" Clara could only manage a numb nod, her body trembling. He stared at her for a long moment more, his gaze weighing her, measuring her, and then he turned and left, the quiet click of the door latch an echo of his chilling promise. The Dry Hollow jail was a single stone room with 2 cells, smelling of stale sweat, cheap whiskey, and despair. Eli sat on the hard cot in one of them, listening to the buzz of the flies. Sheriff Miller had thrown him in, charging him with disturbing the peace and brandishing a weapon. A lie, as Eli had been unarmed, but a lie that would stick. The night guard came on duty as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the barred window. He was an older man named Jebediah, known to most as Jeb. He had a limp from a wound he'd taken at Shiloh and a weary, world-worn look in his eyes that suggested he'd seen far worse things than a disrupted wedding. He set a tin plate of beans and a cup of water on the floor and slid it under the bars. "Sheriff says you're not to have any visitors," Jeb said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Horace Blackwood wants you to sit and think on what you've done." "I've got plenty to think about," Eli replied, making no move toward the food. "You could make it easier on yourself," Jeb suggested, leaning against the opposite wall. "Give a proper apology to Mr. Blackwood. Swear you'll ride out and never come back. He might be inclined to let it go." Eli gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Apologize? For what? For trying to stop a man from buying a girl like she's a piece of livestock?" Jeb was silent for a moment. "It was a legal marriage contract. You interfered." "There's the law," Eli said, his voice hardening. "And then there's what's right. I've seen men follow the law straight to hell." He looked at Jeb, his gaze direct and piercing. "You were a soldier. You ever see a man do something wrong because he was just following orders?" The question hit its mark. Jeb's face tightened, his eyes looking at something far away, a memory of smoke and cannon fire. More times than I can count. Then you know, Eli said softly. He finally spoke, his voice low and laced with an old, deep pain. I had a wife once. Her name was Anna. We were young, didn't have a penny to our names, but we were building a life. Her father, he was a man who valued land more than his own daughter. He broke our marriage, said it wasn't legal, and promised her to a man twice her age, a man with 1,000 acres. She pleaded. I tried to fight for her, but I was young and foolish. I got myself arrested, much like today. He paused, swallowing hard. They held the wedding while I sat in a cell. She went through with it, stood there like a ghost. A week later, she walked into the river and never came out. The silence in the jail was profound. The only sound was a cricket chirping somewhere in the stone walls. I wasn't there to save her, Eli finished, his voice raw. I failed her. When I looked at that girl, at Clara, standing at that altar today, I saw Anna. I saw the same look in her eyes. I'm not going to apologize for trying to stop it from happening all over again. Jeb looked at the prisoner, and for the first time, he didn't see a troublemaking drifter. He saw a man haunted by a grief he understood. He had seen generals make decisions that cost good men their lives, all in the name of some grand strategy. He had seen politicians make laws that starved families, all in the name of progress. He was suddenly and acutely aware that the justice he upheld in Dry Hollow was nothing more than the will of Horace Blackwood. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't sit right. Clara spent the night on the floor of her room, not sleeping. She was beyond tears. A cold, hard resignation was setting in. Horace was right. Eli had offered her a moment's hope, but he couldn't fight the whole world for her. No one could. Her aunt was right. She owed a debt. This was the payment. Just before dawn, an idea came to her. She had to warn him. She had to tell him to save himself. She tore a small, blank page from the back of her Bible and, using a nub of charcoal from the cold fireplace, she began to write. Her hand trembled. The words were simple, stark, and full of a quiet despair. Eli, they are making me go through with it tomorrow. Do not try to stop it again. You will only get yourself killed. Horace is a powerful man. There is no fighting him. I am sorry for the trouble I have caused you. I had a foolish dream once, but it is gone now. I accept what I must do. Thank you for showing me what a kind face looks like. Do not worry for me. I will be like a statue. Statues do not feel anything. Clara. She folded the small, fragile note. She waited, listening. She heard the familiar pre-dawn sound of the young cattle herder, the boy who had brought news to Eli, whistling as he guided his small herd past the edge of town. Peeking through her curtains, she saw him. With desperate stealth, she managed to pry open her window, the wood groaning in protest. She leaned out, her heart pounding. "Boy," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Will you help me?" He looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. She showed him the note and a small, tarnished silver locket, the only thing she had left of her mother's. "Please," she begged in a whisper, "take this to the man in the jail, the drifter, and take this locket for your trouble. But tell no one. Swear it." The boy, seeing the desperation in her face, simply nodded, took the note and the locket, and disappeared into the gray morning light, leaving Clara to face the day of her second and final wedding. The moon was a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky when Jebediah's key scraped in the lock. The sound was soft, but in the profound silence of the jail, it was as loud as a breaking bone. Eli was on his feet in an instant, every muscle tensed. Jeb didn't speak. He simply opened the cell door, a silent invitation. In one hand, he held Eli's gun belt and his hat. In the other, he held the small, folded note the cattle herder boy had delivered hours before. He passed the note through the bars first. Eli's heart seized as he recognized the delicate, hesitant script. Statues do not feel anything. The words were a shard of ice in his gut. He looked from the note to Jeb, a question in his eyes. "The back door is unbolted," Jeb said, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the air. "Your horse is tied up in the alley behind the mercantile. I took the liberty. Figured a man ought to have his own mount." He pushed the gun belt through the opening. "This town's justice is bought and paid for. I reckon it's time someone introduced a debt it can't settle." He looked at Eli, the weary veteran seeing not a drifter, but a soldier fighting a different kind of war. "Go on, son. The world's bigger than Dry Hollow." Eli strapped on his gun belt, the familiar weight a grim comfort. He took his hat. "I'm in your debt, Jeb." "No," the old guard said, turning to walk back to his desk, his limp more pronounced in the quiet of the night. "You're not. Now get." Eli didn't need to be told twice. He slipped out the back door and into the cool night. The town was asleep, a collection of dark, geometric shapes huddled under a canopy of indifferent stars. He moved through the shadows, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. He found his roan just where Jeb had said, and in moments he was in the saddle, a ghost moving silently through the streets that had condemned him. But he did not ride west. He turned his horse toward the small, severe house at the edge of town, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. Clara's note was a surrender, a white flag raised over a defeated soul, and he would not accept it. He found her in the stable. He wasn't sure what had drawn him there. Perhaps the instinct that she would seek refuge in the quiet company of the animals rather than the suffocating confines of the house. The stable door was ajar, and a sliver of moonlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a figure sitting on a hay bale, her back to him. He dismounted, tethering his horse beside her old mare. He made a soft sound, a low whistle, so as not to startle her. She flinched, turning, her eyes wide and luminous in the gloom. "Eli," she breathed, her voice a fragile whisper. She looked like a ghost, wrapped in a thin shawl, her face pale and tear-streaked in the moonlight. In 3 long strides, he was before her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He dropped to one knee in the straw and took her hands in his. They were ice cold. He could feel the fine tremor that ran through her entire body. He looked at her, at the bruised cheek her aunt had given her, at the profound despair in her eyes, and the fury that had been simmering in him since he'd read her note solidified into a fierce, protective resolve. "Statues," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're no statue, Clara." A single, wrenching sob broke from her, a sound she had held back for a lifetime. "I have to," she cried, her voice cracking. "There's no other way. He'll destroy you. He'll destroy everything." "Let him try," Eli said, his grip on her hands tightening. "I'm not leaving you here." He rose, pulling her gently to her feet, and then she was in his arms, her face buried against his chest, her small frame shaking with the force of her weeping. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, his own eyes burning. The air in the stable was thick with the scent of dry hay, old leather, and the warm, earthy smell of the horses shifting in their stalls. He held her for a long time, letting her cry out all the fear and loneliness and pain that had been her constant companions. When her sobs finally quieted, she looked up at him, her eyes shimmering. The moonlight caught the silver tracks of her tears on her cheeks. "No one," she whispered, her voice raw. "No one has ever stood for me before." "Then it's about time someone did," he said softly. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not an orphan or a transaction, but a woman of incredible strength he was only just beginning to comprehend. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of anger and solace. It was a raw, hungry claiming, a silent declaration against Horace Blackwood, against the town, against the cruel world that had tried to crush them both. Her lips parted under his, and she kissed him back with an equal, startling ferocity. Her arms went around his neck, pulling him closer, her fingers tangling in his hair. It was a kiss that sealed a promise made in a church and a vow whispered in a jail cell. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Clara leaned her forehead against his, her eyes closed. "I never knew," she whispered. "I never knew what it was to be wanted for myself." "I want to take you away from here," Eli said, his voice urgent. "Right now. We can ride west. Be gone before the sun comes up. We'll find a place where no one knows our names." It was the easy answer, the drifter's answer. "Run!" But as he said it, he felt her stiffen slightly in his arms. She pulled back, her gaze clear and resolute in the moonlight. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "I won't run. Eli, I've been running my whole life, hiding in my aunt's house, hiding behind quiet obedience. If I run with you now, I'll still be running from him. I'll spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. He will have won. He will have made me a coward." Eli stared at her, taken aback by the fire in her voice. This was not the frightened girl from the church. This was someone new, someone being forged in the crucible of this terrible ordeal. "What then?" he asked. "I will face him," she said, her chin lifting. "Tomorrow, in that church, I will tell him no. Not in a whisper, not in a secret note, but in front of the whole town. I will not be a statue, and I will not be a coward. I will be free, and I will choose it for myself." He saw the unshakable truth in her eyes. She was right. To run would be to trade one cage for another. Her freedom had to be taken, not given. It had to be declared in the very place where it was meant to be signed away. "All right, Clara," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, a smile of pure admiration. "We'll do it your way." The tension of the last 2 days, the fear and the adrenaline, seemed to drain away, replaced by a new, profound intimacy. They were no longer just a drifter and an orphan. They were partners, allies in a war of two against the world. The hay rustled as he led her to a quiet corner of the stable. The horses breathed softly in the darkness. There, in the hay, under the silent gaze of the moon, they came together. It was not a frantic, hurried act, but a slow, deliberate discovery. For Eli, it was an act of gentle reverence, a mending of old wounds, a way of protecting the memory of the woman he had lost by fiercely protecting the one he had found. For Clara, it was a revelation. It was the first time in her life her body was her own, a source of pleasure and connection, not a commodity to be bartered. Their coming together was a quiet, desperate, and beautiful rebellion, a silent language of solace and belonging, an unspoken vow that they were no longer alone. It was a single, perfect night of freedom stolen from a world that had offered them none. Long before the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, Eli stirred. He dressed quietly in the dark, the reality of the coming days settling over him. He stood over her for a moment, watching her sleep in the hay, a small, peaceful smile on her lips. She looked younger, unburdened. He knelt and brushed a stray piece of straw from her hair. Her eyes fluttered open. "I have to go," he whispered. "If they find me here, it's over before it begins. I'll be close. I'll be watching." She nodded, the sleepiness in her eyes giving way to the same resolve as before. "I'm not afraid," she said, and for the first time, it was the truth. He kissed her one last time, a soft, lingering kiss full of the night's promises. "The choice is yours, Clara," he said, his hand resting on her cheek. "It always was. You just have to claim it." Then he was gone, melting back into the shadows, leaving her alone in the quiet of the stable to greet the sunrise of the day that would decide her fate. The second time Clara walked down the aisle of the dry hollow church, the air was different. The day before, the mood had been one of simple, procedural finality, like the branding of cattle. Today, it was a thick, volatile thing, simmering with gossip and morbid anticipation. The pews were even more crowded. The whole town had come not to witness a wedding, but to see the conclusion of a drama, to watch the taming of a girl who had dared to hesitate. Clara felt their eyes on her, but the stares no longer pierced her skin. The night in the stable with Eli had forged a shield around her heart. She was no longer a ghost moving through a life that belonged to others. She wore the same heavy dress, but she carried it differently. Her back was straight. Her head was held high. She was not a victim being led to a sacrifice. She was a combatant walking onto a battlefield of her own choosing. Her Aunt Martha gripped her arm, her fingers like a vice. "Remember what is at stake," Martha whispered, her voice a low, urgent hiss. "Smile. For God's sake, girl, smile." Clara did not smile. She did not even look at her aunt. Her gaze was fixed on the altar, where Horace Blackwood stood waiting. He looked less like a groom and more like a warden reclaiming an escaped prisoner. A smug, proprietary confidence radiated from him. He had made his threats, asserted his power, and he was certain he had won. He saw her coming down the aisle not as a victory of love, but as a successful negotiation, a reassertion of the natural order of things. She reached the altar. The mayor, his face beaded with sweat, once again placed her hand in Horace's. His grip was a manacle, hot and tight. She could feel the triumphant pulse in his thumb. She did not pull away. She stood still, gathering her strength, a silent reservoir of resolve. Reverend Miller, looking deeply uncomfortable, cleared his throat and began again, his voice rushing through the familiar words as if hoping to outrun any further incident. "Dearly beloved, we are once again gathered here today." Clara tuned out the drone of his voice. She thought of Eli's hands holding hers in the straw. She thought of his promise to be watching. She thought of her own vow, made to herself in the quiet, pre-dawn light. "I will choose for myself." The moment arrived, as she knew it would. The point of the spear. "Do you, Clara May Thompson?" the Reverend asked, his eyes darting nervously between her and Horace. "Take this man, Horace Blackwood, to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part." The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in the church held their breath. This was the moment. Horace's grip on her hand tightened. A silent, painful command. Her aunt's eyes burned into her back. The world narrowed to that single, suffocating question. Clara turned her head slowly, deliberately, and looked Horace Blackwood directly in the eye. She let him see the calm, clear defiance that had replaced her fear, and in a voice that was not a whisper, not a cry, but a clear, steady bell that rang through the breathless sanctuary, she said one word. "No." For a heartbeat, the word just hung there, an impossible object suspended in the air. Then Horace's face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction, shattered. It collapsed into a contortion of pure, incandescent rage. The public humiliation was more than he could bear. His authority, his very identity in this town, had been publicly shredded by an orphan girl with nothing to her name. With a guttural roar, he tore the delicate lace veil from her head, the ripping sound an act of violence in itself, and then, before anyone could react, he swung his open hand and slapped her across the face with all his force. The crack of the blow echoed in the church, a sound more shocking than the gunshot the day before. Clara staggered back, a cry of pain escaping her lips, her cheek exploding in a starburst of fire. A collective, horrified gasp swept through the pews. This was not a business transaction gone awry. This was brutal, naked cruelty, laid bare for all to see. In that moment of stunned silence, Clara looked past Horace, her eyes instinctively searching for her aunt. She saw Martha standing there, frozen, her face a pale mask of horror and fury. But she did not move. She did not step forward. She did not say a word. She simply stood by and watched, a silent accomplice to the final, violent payment of a debt. Then, a new figure appeared in the church doorway, just as he had the day before. It was Eli. He stood there, framed by the harsh noon light. But this time was different. He was not dusty from a hard ride. He was calm, centered, and his hands were empty. His gun belt was gone. He was not a threat. He was a choice. He ignored the angry, confused shouts that were beginning to erupt from the men in the pews. He ignored Horace, who was now panting with rage, his hand reaching once more for the gun at his side. Eli's eyes were only for Clara. He looked at her, at the red mark blooming on her cheek, at the shredded veil on the floor, at the defiant tears welling in her eyes, and his expression was one of profound, unwavering validation. And then he simply raised his hand, palm open, and held it out to her. It was an invitation. It was a question. It was the future. The church erupted. The town, which had been a single unified entity of judgment, fractured down the middle. "This is an outrage," shouted the blacksmith, jumping to his feet. "He's making a mockery of this town." Several other men rose with him, their faces red with anger. They were men who understood hierarchy, property, and the rule of the strong. They saw Eli as chaos, and Clara's defiance as an attack on the very bedrock of their world. Tradition was a fortress, and its walls had been breached. But then, something else happened. A different sound rose from the other side of the church. It started with Mrs. Gable, the mercantile owner's wife. She, who had advised Clara on her wifely duties, stood up. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning. She looked at Horace, then at Clara, and took a half step into the aisle, as if to form a barricade. Another woman stood, then another. They didn't shout. They didn't draw weapons. They created a silent, human wall of empathy. These were the women who had endured hard husbands and harder lives, who had buried their own dreams under layers of duty and obedience. In Clara's single, courageous no, they heard an echo of a word they had never dared to speak themselves. They saw not a scandal, but a rebellion they could join with their very presence. Their silent, collective stand was more powerful than the men's angry shouts. Clara saw it all in a flash. Horace's murderous rage, her aunt's betrayal, the town dividing before her very eyes, and she saw Eli, standing steady at the door, his hand outstretched, waiting. She made her choice. She turned her back on Horace Blackwood and the altar. She walked, not ran, down the aisle. The angry men started to move, but they were impeded by the silent, unmoving phalanx of women. Clara walked right through the path they had made for her, her gaze locked with Eli's. When she reached him, she placed her hand in his fingers closed around hers, strong and sure. And at that exact moment, the impossible happened. A low rumble of thunder shook the church's foundation, a sound so foreign in the perpetual drought that people looked up at the rafters in confusion. As Eli and Clara stepped out of the church and into the street, the first drop of rain struck the dust between them, raising a dark, coin-sized circle, then another and another. The sky, which had been a sheet of white-hot metal moments before, had turned a bruised slate gray. A sudden cool wind swept down the street, carrying the smell of ozone and wet earth, the smell of a miracle. Within seconds, the drops became a downpour. A torrential, cleansing flood unleashed itself from the heavens. The rain hammered on the tin roofs, churned the dust into thick, running mud, and washed the world clean. It was a baptism. They began to run, hand in hand, disappearing into the gray, shimmering curtain of the storm. The shouts from the church faded behind them, swallowed by the roar of the downpour. The rain plastered Clara's hair to her face and soaked through Eli's shirt, but they laughed. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated freedom. The water washed the tears and the sting from her cheek, washed the trail dust from his shoulders, and for a few sacred moments, it washed Dry Hollow and all its judgments off the face of the earth, leaving only two people running toward an unknown horizon, their past cleansed by a magical, impossible rain. The flight from Dry Hollow was a desperate, mud-soaked blur. The miraculous storm that had been their salvation became their first trial, turning the parched land into a treacherous quagmire. They pushed Eli's roan hard, riding double through the night, the rain washing away their tracks and chilling them to the bone. For 2 days they traveled, pushing deeper into the unforgiving wilderness of the hill country, leaving the world of men and their brittle laws far behind. They found their refuge by sheer luck, an old, abandoned trapper's cabin nestled deep in a pine-choked ravine, almost invisible until you were upon it. It was a crude, lonely structure of notched logs, chinked with mud that had long since crumbled. The roof sagged, the single window was a shuttered eye, and the door hung from one leather hinge. But it had 4 walls and a stone fireplace. It was a fortress. Their new life was stripped to its barest elements: fire, water, food, and shelter. The grand emotions of their escape, the defiance, the passion, the terror, were luxuries they could no longer afford. Survival was a relentless, all-consuming master. Love, they quickly learned, was not a thing of soft words and gentle kisses. It was the grim satisfaction of Eli returning with 2 snared rabbits. It was the quiet pride in Clara's face when she found a patch of edible wild onions. It was sharing the last piece of hardtack without comment, or huddling together for warmth under a single threadbare blanket as the temperature plummeted at night. Their days were a rhythm of harsh realities. Eli taught Clara how to find clean water from a spring that trickled from a rock face a half-mile away, and the daily trek with 2 heavy wooden buckets became her responsibility. He showed her how to read the tracks of deer and the telltale signs of a rabbit run. Clara, in turn, discovered a resilience she never knew she possessed. She learned to mend their worn clothes with a clumsy but determined needle, to make a thin, watery stew last for 2 days, to listen to the language of the forest, the snap of a twig that meant a deer, the shriek of a hawk that meant danger. The greatest danger was the cold, and its high priest was the fire. The hearth was the heart of their world. Keeping it fed was a constant, back-breaking labor of gathering fallen branches and sawing through logs with a rusty, half-broken saw they found in the cabin. At night, they would sit before it, the flames painting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, and sometimes, in the deep, profound silence of the wilderness, the wolves would howl, their calls echoing through the ravine, a chilling, mournful sound that served as a constant reminder of their isolation and the thin, fragile wall that separated them from the raw, untamed world outside. In those moments, Eli would instinctively move closer to her, his arm a solid, reassuring weight around her shoulders. But their shared hardship also began to expose the cracks in their individual armors. Eli, haunted by a past he never spoke of, became fiercely, suffocatingly protective. "You stay here, by the fire," he'd command when he went to check his snares. "It's not safe out there." "I can help," she would insist, her jaws set. "Show me how to use the rifle." "No," he'd say, his voice flat and final. "That's my job. Your job is to stay safe." The conflict came to a head one bitter afternoon. She had taken his hunting knife and was practicing throwing it at a tree stump, her attempts clumsy but determined. He came upon her suddenly and snatched the knife from her hand, his face a thundercloud of anger. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he demanded. "Learning," she shot back, her own temper flaring. "Learning to be something other than helpless. You can't do everything. Eli, what if something happens to you? Should I just sit here and starve, or let the wolves have me? Nothing is going to happen to me, he growled. I won't let it. I'm here to protect you. I don't need a protector, she cried, her voice cracking with a frustration that had been building for weeks. I just left a man who wanted to own me. I won't trade a jailer for a warden, even if he's a kind one. I need a partner, Eli, or I have nothing. The word hung in the cold air between them, sharp and painful. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had allowed her to say no in that church. And he realized with a jolt that in his desperate attempt to keep her safe, he was smothering the very spirit he had fallen in love with. He said nothing, simply handed the knife back to her and walked away, the chasm between them wider and colder than the frozen creek at the bottom of the ravine. The turning point came as autumn bled into a harsh, early winter. A chilling rain turned to sleet, and then to snow, trapping them in the damp, drafty cabin. The relentless cold and their meager diet took their toll, and Clara fell ill. It started as a cough, then deepened into a fever that left her shivering and delirious in their shared bedroll. Eli was consumed by a terror he had not felt since the day he'd heard of Anna's death. He was helpless. All his strength, his skill with a rifle, his knowledge of the wilderness, they were useless against the enemy that was consuming her from within. He bathed her face with snowmelt, forced warm broth between her lips, and piled every scrap of covering they had on top of her. But the fever raged on. For 3 days and nights, he did not sleep, watching the fragile rise and fall of her chest, his heart clenching with every shallow, ragged breath she took. He was failing again. The ghost of his past sat in the corner of the cabin, watching him with cold, accusatory eyes. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Clara awoke, weak and drenched in sweat, but her eyes were clear. She saw him sitting by her side, his face gaunt, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and fear. He looked utterly broken. That night, as she sipped a broth he had made, the silence between them was different. It was not the tense silence of their argument, but a fragile, tender quiet. You were so afraid, she whispered, her voice still weak. He just nodded, unable to speak, his gaze fixed on the fire. Why? She asked gently. Tell me, Eli, tell me what haunts you. And finally, the dam inside him broke. He told her about Anna, about their young love, and about her father's cruel bargain. His voice was a low monotone of remembered pain. I should have fought harder, he said, his voice cracking. But I let them take me. I sat in a cell, full of rage and pride, while she faced them alone. I thought I was being strong, but I was a coward. I let her go through with it. I wasn't there for her. He finally looked at Clara, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. When she died, everyone said it was the grief that took her, but it wasn't. It was the loneliness. I abandoned her to it. And when I saw you, standing at that altar, I saw her, and I couldn't be a coward again. Clara listened, her heart aching for him. She finally understood. His need to protect her wasn't about her weakness. It was about his own perceived failure. It was his penance. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. You didn't fail me, Eli, she whispered. You saved me. As if summoned by his confession, the wind began to howl outside, and a furious blizzard descended upon the ravine, shaking the small cabin to its foundations. The snow came down in a thick, blinding curtain, erasing the world, isolating them completely. The wind shrieked through the cracks in the logs, and the cold was a physical, predatory thing. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. The confession had burned away the secrets and the misunderstandings between them, leaving only the raw, honest truth of two wounded souls. They were no longer the protector and the protected. They were equals, bound by a shared struggle and a shared past of pain. He added more logs to the fire until it roared in defiance of the storm. In the flickering golden light, he looked at her, and she at him. There were no more walls between them. He came to her, and in the rough bedroll, as the blizzard raged outside, they found each other again. This time, it was not the gentle discovery of their first night, but something deeper, more elemental. It was fierce and desperate, a clinging together against the vast, violent indifference of the storm. It was a silent, solemn acknowledgement of all the pain they had endured and a fierce, unspoken promise to face whatever came next together, in the heart of the storm, sheltered by the fragile walls of their refuge. Their love was reforged, no longer just a flight from the past, but a defiant stand against the future, a bond as raw, as powerful, and as resilient as the wilderness itself. Horace Blackwood's humiliation did not fade with the rain. It festered, turning from hot rage into a cold, obsessive poison. In the weeks following the disastrous wedding, he became a recluse, his power in Dry Hollow corroded by the town's open gossip and the silent, judging eyes of the women who had stood against him. He had been made a fool, his authority challenged and his property stolen. He would not let it stand. His reach was long, and his purse was deep. He sent a rider south, toward the border, with a heavy bag of coin and a simple, brutal directive: find the girl and the drifter who took her. The message found its way to a man named Rojas. He was not a common bounty hunter. He was a tracker, a man who read the earth like other men read books. He led a small, hard-bitten crew who operated in the lawless lands where territories bled into one another. Rojas took Blackwood's money, but his motivation was a colder, sharper thing than mere greed. He was a man of rigid, archaic principles. He believed in a natural order, an order in which men held dominion and women were possessions to be protected, disciplined, and controlled. A runaway woman was an offense against this order, a tear in the very fabric of his world. Returning Clara was not just a job, it was a duty. For weeks, the trail was cold, washed away by the storm, but Rojas was patient. He worked his way outward from Dry Hollow, questioning lonely ranchers and isolated prospectors, until he picked up a whisper of a couple matching their description heading into the high hill country. As winter began to lock its icy teeth into the landscape, he found their first abandoned campsite. And then he found their tracks, faint but unmistakable in a patch of hardened mud. The hunt had truly begun. He found the cabin during the thaw that followed the first great blizzard. He'd been tracking them for 2 days through the deep snow, his movements silent and ghost-like. He observed the cabin from a high ridge for a full day, his dark eyes missing nothing: the thin plume of smoke, the single set of tracks leading to the spring, the rhythm of their isolated existence. He saw Eli leave in the early morning, rifle in hand, heading deeper into the ravine to check his trap lines. And then he saw his opportunity. Clara was outside, gathering firewood. When he emerged from the trees, he moved with a predator's grace, making no sound. One moment she was alone in the vast, silent wilderness. The next, he was there, a dark, imposing figure against the white snow. He was not a large man, but he radiated a coiled, dangerous energy. 2 of his men fanned out behind him, cutting off any chance of escape. "Clara May Thompson," Rojas said. It was not a question. His voice was soft, with a heavy accent, yet it carried an absolute authority. "Mr. Blackwood sends his regards. It is time for you to come home." Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through Clara. But it was not the paralyzing terror of her old life. It was the fear of an animal being cornered, a fear that came with the instinct to fight. "I have no home there," she said, her voice steady, her hand tightening on the hatchet she used for splitting kindling. Rojas smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "A woman's home is with her husband. You have forgotten your place. We are here to remind you." He cared nothing for the money he was offered, but everything for the principle of the matter. This was about restoring what had been broken, about putting a wayward piece of property back where it belonged. She took a step back, raising the hatchet. "Stay away from me," he laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "You have spirit. It is a pity it must be broken." Before she could react, he lunged. The hatchet was knocked from her hand, and his iron grip closed around her arm. She struggled, fighting with a ferocity that surprised him. But he was too strong. Her hands were bound, and a gag was stuffed in her mouth. She was a prisoner once more. Eli felt it first as a prickle of unease on the back of his neck. The woods were too quiet. He had found 2 rabbits in his snares and was heading back, his thoughts on the warm stew they would make, when the feeling turned to a cold dread. He quickened his pace, breaking into a run as the cabin came into view. The sight that met him stole the breath from his lungs. Clara was tied to a tree near the cabin. Rojas stood before her, his back to Eli. The other 2 men were ransacking the small cabin. Eli dropped the rabbits, his rifle coming to his shoulder in a single fluid motion. "Let her go!" Eli's voice rang out, flat and deadly cold, slicing through the winter air. Rojas turned slowly, his face calm, almost serene. "Ah, the thief," he said. "You stole something that did not belong to you. I am simply returning it." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Eli snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. "That is where you are wrong," Rojas replied softly, and with a sudden, impossibly fast movement, he drew a long knife and held its blade to Clara's throat. Clara's eyes, wide with terror, locked with Eli's. "Checkmate." "Put the rifle down," Rojas commanded. "Or she dies, then you die, and I still collect my fee." Rage and helplessness warred within Eli. He could not risk a shot. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered the rifle and let it fall into the snow. The other 2 men emerged from the cabin and quickly relieved him of the pistol at his hip. "I do not want to kill you," Rojas said, his eyes glittering. "But I will not have my honor, or Mr. Blackwood's, insulted by a common drifter. You and I will settle this, like men." He pushed Clara away from him and toward one of his men. "If I fall, kill them both." Then he turned to face Eli, the long, wicked knife still in his hand. What followed was not a fight. It was a butchering. Eli was strong and a capable brawler, but Rojas moved with a brutal, economical grace. He fought not with anger, but with a cold, precise artistry. The snow became a canvas for their desperate struggle. Eli landed a heavy blow to Rojas's jaw, but the tracker absorbed it and answered with a slash that opened a deep gash on Eli's arm. They crashed to the ground, kicking and gouging, their breath misting in the frigid air. Eli fought with the desperation of a man protecting his whole world. Rojas fought with the dispassionate skill of an executioner. The fight ended when Rojas drove his knife deep into Eli's side. A terrible, ragged cry was torn from Eli's lips, and he collapsed onto his back, the pristine snow around him instantly turning a dark, vivid crimson. Rojas stood over him, breathing heavily, a triumphant sneer on his face. He raised his knife for the final, killing blow. It was in that moment that 2 things happened at once. From the edge of the trees, a voice boomed, "That's far enough, Rojas!" And from the cabin, Clara emerged, her face a mask of horrified determination. In her trembling hands, she held Eli's heavy rifle. Jebediah, the old jail guard, stepped into the clearing, flanked by the blacksmith and 2 other grim-faced men from Dry Hollow, all of them armed. Rojas and his men froze, stunned by the sudden appearance of reinforcements. "What is this?" Rojas snarled, his attention diverted for a fatal second. In that second, Clara acted. The memory of Eli's words, "I'll teach you," flashed through her mind. She had never fired a gun in her life. The rifle was heavy, unwieldy. She lifted it, the stock clumsy against her shoulder. She closed her eyes for a split second, saw Eli's blood spreading on the snow, and her hesitation vanished. burned away by a love so fierce it eclipsed her fear. She wasn't aiming to kill, she was aiming to stop. She pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder like a mule. The explosion deafening in the winter silence. The bullet went wide of its mark, not hitting Rojas, but striking the tree just beside his head with a loud thwack, sending bark and splinters flying into his face. He cried out in pain and surprise, stumbling backward, dropping his knife as he clawed at his eyes. The distraction was all Jebediah needed. A shot from his pistol sent Rojas's men scrambling for cover. The tide had turned in a single, chaotic instant. But Clara didn't see any of it. Her world had narrowed to the man bleeding out in the snow. She dropped the heavy rifle and ran to Eli's side, falling to her knees in the blood-soaked snow. He was pale, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were open, and they were fixed on her. A faint, pained smile touched his lips. "You did it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You saved me." She ripped a strip of cloth from her petticoat, her hands shaking as she pressed it against the deep wound in his side. She was no longer the girl who needed to be led, the statue who felt nothing, the woman who needed a protector. Kneeling in the snow, with the smell of gunpowder in the air and her love's lifeblood on her hands, Clara had finally, irrevocably, claimed her own. She was the one who fought back. The journey back to Dry Hollow was a slow, agonizing procession, a testament to raw will. Eli, drifting in and out of consciousness, was slung over the blacksmith's sturdy horse. Clara never left his side, riding her old mare, her face set in a grim mask of determination. She constantly checked his bandages, which were soaked through with blood, her heart seizing with every pained groan that escaped his lips. Jebediah and his small posse rode with their rifles ready, their faces etched with a gravity that spoke of a coming reckoning. Rojas and his men, disarmed and bound, were herded along like cattle, their arrogant silence a stark contrast to their earlier bravado. They arrived not at noon, but in the gray, unforgiving light of dawn. The town was just beginning to stir. Their ragged group appearing at the end of the main street was a silent, powerful spectacle. A few early risers stopped in their tracks, their eyes widening at the sight of the bloody, half-conscious Eli, the captured bounty hunters, and the transformed Clara, no longer a frightened girl, but a woman of pale, cold fury. Cold. They did not stop at the doctor's office first. Jebediah led them directly to Horace Blackwood's large, imposing house. He hammered on the door with the butt of his pistol. Horace appeared, dressed in a silk robe, his face a mask of annoyance that quickly curdled into shock and disbelief as he took in the scene on his doorstep. His eyes fixed on the bound Rojas, then on the bleeding Eli, and finally on Clara. "What is the meaning of this?" he boomed, trying to reclaim his authority. "Sheriff, arrest these men for trespassing." "Sheriff Miller's authority is no longer recognized in this matter," Jebediah said, his voice carrying the weight of a judge. "Horace Blackwood, you're under arrest." Horace let out a bark of incredulous laughter. "Arrest? On what grounds? You have no power here, you old cripple." "My power," Jebediah said, his voice ringing with a conviction he hadn't felt in years, "comes from the men you've cheated and the laws you've broken." He gestured to the blacksmith. "It comes from men like Thomas here, whose father's land deed you forged after his death. It comes from the half-dozen ranch hands you hired and sent home without a penny of their wages, 2 of whom I spoke to myself." His gaze was as hard as iron. "And it comes from the charge of attempted murder for hiring these men to hunt and kill a man, and to kidnap a woman to force her into a marriage she refused. That's not just a sin. Horace, it's a federal crime." Horace's face went from red to a pasty white. His power had always rested on the assumption that no one would dare look too closely, that fear and money could paper over any crime. He had never imagined that the quiet, compliant people of his town had such long memories. He made a desperate, foolish move, lunging back into his house, reaching for a shotgun he kept by the door. But the blacksmith was faster, his powerful frame blocking the way. The fight was over before it began. They dragged him out into the street, a sputtering, roaring beast stripped of all his power. As the commotion drew more people from their homes, another small drama unfolded. Martha, Clara's aunt, came rushing out, her face a pinched knot of anxiety. She saw Clara, alive, and her first words were not of relief, but of accusation. "Clara, what have you done? You've ruined us!" It was then that the women of the town, drawn by the noise, began to form a silent, unforgiving circle. Mrs. Gable, the mercantile owner's wife, stood directly in Martha's path. "She has done nothing, Martha," Mrs. Gable said, her voice cold. "Accept what you were too cowardly to let her do. Live. We all saw what happened in that church. We saw you stand by." Martha looked around, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for an ally, for the familiar comfort of shared judgment against Clara. She found none. She saw only cold, hard stares, a wall of silent condemnation. The women who had once whispered platitudes about a good match now saw her for what she was, a woman who would sell her own kin for a sliver of security and status. She tried to retreat into the mercantile later that day for supplies, but the room fell silent. Mrs. Gable stood behind the counter and simply stared at her, making no move to serve her. Martha, her face burning with a shame far worse than poverty, turned and fled. Her sentence was not to be served in a jail, but in the cold, silent exile of a town that had finally found its conscience. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet healing. Eli's wound had been deep, and a fever nearly took him. But Clara's vigilant nursing pulled him back from the brink. In the small, clean room of the town's only doctor, their love settled, deepening from the frantic passion of fugitives into the steady, quiet rhythm of partners. She read to him, changed his bandages, and held his hand through the long nights, while he watched her with a look of profound, humbled awe. The ghosts of his past had finally been laid to rest. Once Eli was strong enough to walk, leaning heavily on a cane, Reverend Miller came to visit. He was a changed man, his face etched with shame and a newfound humility. "The town, we owe you both an apology," he stammered. "We were blinded by wealth and tradition. We were wrong." He cleared his throat. "I would be honored, the whole town would be, to see you two properly married, in the church, as a celebration, a way to make things right." It was a generous offer, a symbol of their complete and total victory. Clara looked at Eli, and a silent, perfect understanding passed between them. The church was the site of her humiliation, her fear, her imprisonment. Their love hadn't been consecrated within its walls. It had been forged in a stable, tested in the wilderness, and sealed in blood and snow. Their temple was the wide-open world, not a building of wood and dogma. "Thank you, Reverend," Clara said, her voice gentle but firm. "But our vows belong to us, not to the town. We will be married, but we will do it our own way." Their wedding day was not marked by a church bell, but by the setting of the sun. They chose a small, flat mesa that overlooked the vast, rolling plains. The sky a breathtaking canvas of molten gold, deep violet, and fiery orange. Their congregation was small and true. Jebediah, his back straight and his eyes clear, the blacksmith and his wife, and a handful of the women, including Mrs. Gable, who had stood for Clara. Clara wore a simple cotton dress, the color of cream, and had woven a few late-season wildflowers into her hair. Eli, his limp still pronounced, stood beside her, his face clean-shaven, his eyes filled with a peace she had never seen there before. There was no preacher. Jebediah stood before them, his hat held respectfully in his hands. "I ain't a man of fancy words," he began, his gravelly voice filled with a deep sincerity. "But I've seen what's wrong, and today I'm seeing what's right. I've seen two people who were lost find their way home in each other. That's a thing more sacred than any sermon. So, go on, say your piece." Eli turned to Clara, taking both of her hands in his. "Clara May," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I came to Dry Hollow a man running from ghosts. I was half a man. You taught me that courage ain't about fighting or running. It's about standing still for what you love. You were my salvation. I vow to be your partner, your shelter, and your home, for all the days of my life." Tears streamed freely down Clara's face as she looked at him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Eli," she said, her voice a strong, clear whisper against the prairie wind. "I lived my life in a cage, and I didn't even know it until I saw freedom in your eyes. You didn't just save my life, you gave me a life to call my own. I vow to be your partner, your strength, and your home. I will stand with you, always." They slid simple, hand-carved wooden rings onto each other's fingers as the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, painting the world in a soft, ethereal glow. Jebediah smiled. "Well, I reckon that makes it official." Later, as the first stars began to prick the velvet darkness, Clara stood with Eli, her head on his shoulder, looking out over the vast, quiet land that was now their future. He was whole. She was free. They were home. She thought of their journey, the fear, the pain, the impossible odds, and of the simple, unshakable truth they had fought for. "Love isn't something you find," she said softly, as much to herself as to him. "It's something you dare to keep, no matter who forbids it." Thank you for listening to our story here at the Wild West Campfire. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so drop a comment down below and let's connect. Please consider subscribing to the channel for more tales from the frontier, and feel free to share your thoughts on Clara and Eli's journey.